Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 60 organizations looking to promote the story of the American Revolution in Massachusetts and in greater New England. I am Bob Allison. I teach at Suffolk University, and I am also the chair of the Rev 250 Coordinating Committee. And we are delighted to have with us today Nancy Rubin Stuart. And Nancy Rubin Stuart is an award-winning author, journalist, and we're mainly going to focus today on two of her books. I'll first tell you a little bit more. Welcome, Nancy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. Great to be here.
And Nancy, as a BA in English from Tufts University and an MAT from Brown, and she has taught in various places, but she's mainly been a journalist, writer, and in the last decade or so, she has turned to the story of the American Revolution, looking at the lives of some extraordinary women in the Revolution. And the first one you wrote about was Mercy Otis Warren from the town of Barnstable. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to Mercy Otis Warren?
Well, I always start books with a question. And so when I came across Mercy Otis Warren in my research, I said, why don't we know more about her? She's the first female historian of the American Revolution, and really rather extraordinary. So that was my question. And that, of course, led to more research and ultimately the book.
Yes.
And Mercy was unusual. I mean, you know, Revolutionary era women were not supposed to be involved in politics or even talk about it. I mean, home and hearth was their job, clear and simple. But Mercy had an unusual education. Her older brother, James Otis Jr., was being tutored for Harvard. And Mercy was the first daughter of, first daughter, but third child of what would be 13 children. And she was expected to be home with her mother and learning all the things a colonial girl did. And as the oldest daughter, of course, there were many babies and so on. She had a lot to do. But she was fascinated, and she was, you know, intellectually curious and obviously bright. And she begged her father, she became her father's favorite, to please could she sit in on the tutoring sessions with her older brother. And she did. They were being tutored by a relative who was a clergyman in West Barnstable, who lived nearby. And so she did sit in, and she basically could have gone to Harvard if she'd been a girl in a different time. But she learned a great deal. Nevertheless, she knew her place. She did all the proper things. She actually did an quite amazing tea table. Sort of her master's, instead of a chimney thesis, it was her master's in needlework. It's still at the Pilgrim Hall Museum in Plymouth. Nevertheless, she continued to pore over books. She borrowed her brother, call him Jemmy, so we won't confuse her with his father, James, over the books that Jemmy could bring home or share with her, including what made a particular impression upon her were some of the Enlightenment books, such as the John Locke idea of natural rights, which fascinated both Jemmy and her. Now, don't forget, they're under British rule. So she continued with that, and she did marry, but quite late for a colonial woman. She married when she was 26. The theory being that she was too brainy for most of the women around her. Most of the men didn't want her. After all, a learned woman was considered a scourge to her husband and children. And even Rousseau made fun of learned women. They had no time or ambition for their husband and children. She did marry. She married James Warren, the son of the High Sheriff of Plymouth County. And he, too, was a Harvard graduate, but he encouraged her in her work. So he wrote nature poetry, perfectly fine for a colonial woman married to, you know, a wealthy man. And along the way, she had 5 sons. And that was fine, perfectly acceptable, although some of her poems complained about James being away because he had so much to do. He was, as I say, he became the High Sheriff of Plymouth after his father died. And it was there that he met John Adams, who rode circuit through Massachusetts, and they became friends. Eventually, of course, they all four of them, that is Abigail, who was first, then his fiance, they met. But meanwhile, things were heating up in Massachusetts in terms of the British and all of the oppressive acts that were beginning. Her brother Jimmy had become a successful attorney, taking care of the elite in Boston, lived in Boston, but became very upset when the British initiated the writs of assistance. This was an attempt to control all the taxation and all of the goods, anything that would come in from other places, including West Indies. It was a sort of a redo of, or reinitiation of the Molasses Acts of the 1730s. And Jemmy, of course, the colonists were very upset because this meant that not only were they being taxed, but the soldiers, the British authorities, could come into their homes at will and run through their warehouses and then accuse them. Of course, some of them were smuggling. Jemmy became ferocious against the British. In fact, in February of 1761, he initiated a suit against the British, in particular against the officials like Thomas Hutchison. And he declaimed for hours. This went on. John Adams attended. He was about 24 years old. And Jemmy was the first one who accused the British government, which of course was the officials, of course, were the ones involved in the general court, Massachusetts governing government, accused them of taxation without representation and said this is unconstitutional. It was, as John Adams wrote in his one of his notebooks at that point, it was then the child of independence was born. Well, he did lose the case. He kept at it. He kept writing treatises and papers against the increasing oppression of the British. He was soon aligned with Sam Adams. John Adams joined in. They were soon forming the Sons of Liberty. And of course, inevitably, they would come to Plymouth, where it was out of the way from Boston, and they would meet with her husband, James Warren, and Mercy would sit by the chimney piece. She would have served them or had served them food, and she would listen to all of this. And sometimes she would get involved in the conversations. This went on and on through the 1760s as more and more acts occurred. I guess the most notorious of them, there were many, but I guess the most notorious was the Stamp Act. 1769, Jemmy, after many treatises and all of these plots and so on, Jemmy writes and of course these are in the papers, in the newspapers as well, and Jemmy writes a really insulting letter about the British, and he calls them blockheads, and particularly the commanding officer. And at that point, in the British coffee house where he's meeting and talking with people, they brutalize him. They beat him to the point where he is unconscious and he's bleeding terribly. He never really regains his sanity after that. John Adams said that his scars was so deep, this is months later, that you could lay a finger in it. He just loses his mind, but he continues to rant. And of course, the family has to scurry him off to, an isolated place on a farm away from the public view. Mercy, as I say, is writing nature poetry. She's having children. Her husband is very involved in the Sons of Liberty. The Adams, of course, are good friends at that point. That is John and Abigail. And Mercy has to pick up the pieces and write to his friends in England, some of whom were sympathetic, of course, the Whigs, and explain that Jemmy couldn't write anymore, that he couldn't respond to the correspondence. And inevitably, she has correspondence with Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay, who's, again, opposes what the British are doing. By 1773, Mercy is writing on her own, not just nature poetry, but she is beginning to write satirical plays. The first one is called The Adulator. I think it's 1772, against Thomas Hutchison and all the people who are fawning over him. He's the governor at that point. Should I go on, or do you ask some questions?
Well, it's a fascinating story about Mercy Otis Warren, and you've really given us a great background as to how she becomes a writer. I'm wondering if we could just shift gears a little bit, because your more recent book, Defiant Brides, looks at two other women, one of them local, Lucy Flucker, who marries Henry Knox, and the other Peggy Shippen from Philadelphia, who marries Benedict Arnold. You know, these two women from the elite who marry men who were involved in the revolutionary movement. And what brought you to these two characters?
Yes, well, I'm sure you know that to choose a topic for a book is challenging, especially when you're looking 40 years back. Very few, the history of women is pretty much pretty flat. There are exceptions throughout history, but in general it is, because first of all, most women didn't write, or if they did, they wrote at a very rudimentary level, and many didn't read. So to be able to find correspondence from women, and such wonderful correspondence, was certainly something that piqued my interest. And then when I read about them, because they were remarkable women, and those are the ones who are largely, throughout history, going back, those are the ones whose histories, whose lives we know about. And then when I discovered, as I did, of course, that they were so involved in various ways in the revolution, I had to write about them. And they are contrasted. One becomes a patriot and one becomes a traitor. And I thought it'd be great to pair them together and follow the course of their lives through the revolution.
What I really found fascinating were the connections between them. That is, Henry Knox and Major John Andre Andre is Arnold's handler when he becomes a traitor. They spend a night not really knowing each other in a cabin up in upstate New York, and then Benedict Arnold drives Lucy and Henry's daughter to Washington's camp later on, or to Philadelphia later. I mean, you have these connections between these folks, which is really extraordinary that you've mined these and found these links.
Yes, it is. And, at first it all looks pretty good. I mean, Knox, as you said, inadvertently is housed with near Ticonderoga with Andre, who was then a prisoner. Later, he's released and so on. That's the whole other story, part of the book. But Arnold, brings Lucy to Valley Forge because she's just wants to be with Knox all the time. So, and then even much later, and I won't jump too far ahead, but when Arnold is about to be implicated, Knox is involved in that whole scene with Washington over near West Point.
It is one of the interesting things. We think about the men at Valley Forge, but Lucy Knox and other wives of officers were there, as well as wives of soldiers. And so what was Valley Forge like for these women? Well,
we've heard a great deal, and a great deal has been made about the men who starved at Valley Forge throughout that terrible winter. But by spring, things were getting a little better. First of all, there were crops were being grown, and even grasses were being used in salads, and wagons were beginning to come. The weather was better, and supplies were coming in for Washington's men. So things did get better. And there's some women who, of course, were there. I don't know so much right in the depths of winter, say January and February, but certainly by spring. And of course, one of the most flamboyant was Katie Green, Nathaniel Green's wife, who was young, pretty, and loved to flirt with the officers. And she was there, and there were other women who came. And of course, what is very rarely mentioned is there were also camp followers. We can say that these were the women who either followed their men because they wanted to be with them, or came and cooked and nursed and served in other ways, including, I guess, sexual favors. So there were other women there. But by the time that Arnold brought Lucy to Valley Forge, food was plentiful. The men were drilling, and she was thrilled to be there. And in fact, I think it's around there's portraits that are done of some of the officers, including Henry Knox at that time. So things weren't as dire. People, I guess, don't really know about that generally, but it got better.
Yeah. And Lucy never saw her parents again after the evacuation of Boston.
It's a sad story because her parents were violently opposed. They were, of course, subjects of the British. Her father was he was the court-appointed secretary of the province of Massachusetts. Her mother was the heiress to the Waldo Patton, huge tracts of land in Maine. They were the elite. She lived in a townhouse on Summer Street in Boston, and suddenly she's crazy about Henry Knox, who's he was orphaned at a fairly young age, had to leave Boston Latin School, very learned, opened his coffee shop, his bookstore, which also, I guess, had some kind of, and many people came to it, and he was very popular. John Adams went there, Paul Revere went there. I mean, he knew everyone, and he read everything, so he was very knowledgeable. Nevertheless, he was a poor bookseller and bookbinder, and her parents just violently opposed it. But 7 months after she met him, she married him at King's Chapel, and that was it. So then they had a strained relationship for the next few months. It's sort of heartbreaking. And when she got married, only her sister and her half-sister came. Her parents refused to come to the wedding. So she fled when, of course, the violence broke out with Henry. She fled soon afterwards with him, and he fled to Washington, what became Washington's First Army. And she fled to Watertown to a safe house. She never saw them again. It's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, later she has her child just a few months later. They never saw the grandchild.
Yeah. And she and Henry will have 11 children, but only one survives them, which is another heartbreaking part.
There's various accounts of how many. It's kind of hard to. I've seen like 13, but three do survive to adulthood, which is way below that's way below the average. I think it's 15% of all children born, didn't survive at that era. So it's heartbreaking. She's going through the army camps with Henry. She follows him everywhere she can, and she keeps getting pregnant, and either these children live a few years or they die in infancy. It's poignant.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I suppose we should also talk a bit about Peggy Shippen. She's maybe better known than Lucy.
Yes, she is.
And I've seen different stories about, was she instigating Benedict Arnold's treason because of her shopping, or was she an innocent dupe? That you seem to put her as part of the Arnold conspiracy and someone who had learned at an early age that if she throws an hysterical fit, she'll get her way. Yes,
that seems to be what is written about her by a number of relatives. She's from Philadelphia. She's elite. Her father was part of the government council in Philadelphia, an attorney, and he was really a neutralist. And nobody can, I think the historians still, talk about that, what he really was. I would say he was an opportunist. When the Patriots were there, he was involved with the Patriots. He entertained George Washington in his townhouse on Society Hill in Philadelphia back in 1774. Well, when the British came in, the next thing you know is he's entertaining the British officers. And Peggy is a beautiful young woman. She's petite, blonde, I guess blue-eyed, gray blue eyes, very smart, and he's taught her a great deal. Again, unusual for a woman of that era. And he's taught her politics and he's taught her finances, which we find out later. But she knows how to be coy and feminine, and she knows that's the deal. History has, as you said, has never, Bob, been able to figure out exactly what she really was like. And some of the novels and so on have said, oh, she seduced Benedict Arnold soon after they were married. Indeed, soon after they're married, that's when he starts trying to communicate with Clinton and becomes an informant, a spy for the British, just a few weeks later. But there are other reasons why. Anyway, so they make Peggy into this sexual siren who, is really all the time has been on the British sympathizer, and she convinces him. That's one theory. But the other side of that is she was 18 when she married him. He was 19 years older than she was. He was a hero. He was then commandant or governor of Philadelphia, trying to keep the peace. After the British left, things were pretty chaotic, and the British occupation. And she was crazy about him. She was mad about him. So I think, like any young woman at that time anyway, she went with what he wanted to do, and she supported him. And she did. She is implicated clearly, passing letters, passing all kinds of things, communicating with the British for him in many occasions. And of course, some of those letters are later discovered. And she is eventually banished to Arnold, who is, after the treason, is back in New York City.
Now, did her parents have the similar objections to her match with Arnold as Lucy's did?
We don't hear too much about her mother's objection, but Edward Shippen, the Judge Shippen, had great reservations. First of all, Arnold was by then crippled. He almost lost his leg in the Battle of Saratoga, even though he's considered the secret hero, the eagle of Saratoga. He's 19 years older than she is. He has pretty much lost much of his fortune by subsidizing the soldiers in the regiments that he commanded for various battles in Canada and in Saratoga. And he has 3 children from a former marriage. His wife had died. And Judge Shippen's pretty shrewd. He investigates Arnold's history, talks to people writes to people in Connecticut, where Arnold is from, and tries to find out what his what he was like in his business dealings. He'd been an apothecary with a lot of trade to the West Indies. And so he has some reservations, but Peggy's a pretty strong-minded character. And again, as you said earlier, and it's true, if she didn't get her way, she usually would scream, cry, not sleep, go on hunger strikes, and become ill. And so reluctantly, in April of 1779, they wed.
Wow. Now, one of the other episodes, a little known, I think, to us, is the Méjianza that the British soldiers put on in Philadelphia. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and Peggy is part of it. Yes, she is. And there's a very famous picture that actually Andre sketched of her. He was quite an artist, with her 2-foot-high hairdo. She's just I think she's just 18. And I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Méjianza, or however we pronounce it, was a festival that was to celebrate the retirement of Clinton, who, by the way, was pretty angry that he wasn't getting reinforcements from England that he wanted. So he was retiring, and against rather reluctantly, Howe was going to take over. So it was a grand celebration. It was extravagant. It was an entire 24 hours with squadrons on the river, with festivals, with balls that lasted all night, with pageantry, and jousts, medieval jousts, with people in armor, I guess. Quite a retirement party.
Yeah, but it was a heck of a retirement party. And the Patriots, who was still in in Philadelphia at that time, this is still the British occupancy, are horrified. But by the way, so are some of the British at the expense that was lavished on this affair. But for Peggy, 18, maybe 17 and a half, and her girlfriends, Becky Franks and Peggy Chu and so on, this is a grand opportunity, because they'd been flirting with and dancing with and going on outings with the British officers anyway. Some of them, they were going to marry some of the wealthy British officers and go back to England. Don't forget here in America was considered pretty provincial and dull. And, they would marry a British officer. And so it was a great, fantastic thing for these girls to be there. And Peggy insisted on going. She had to be outfitted in a very elaborate costume, and she wears a turban in that picture that, and we don't see the gown, but we see her with the hairdo and all that. And the Quakers in Philadelphia were horrified and went to Judge Shippen and said, don't let them do this, for various reasons. But of course they did. So,
wow. Yeah. But thinking about the attraction of these men in uniform, and Lucy Flucker is also stricken with young Henry in his uniform and with his bandaged hand.
Yes.
And then seeing him marching in a parade. But then as an army wife, she keeps wanting him to get out of the army.
Well, Lucy keeps hammering on him. She had been in that safe house when she had the baby. And then when the Continental Army went south, once they were there in New York, nothing had happened. The British weren't there yet. She is very upset that other women were there with their husbands. And so she travels with this newborn baby to New York. She's only there a very short time. Henry's living in the Bowery with other soldiers. And so they're there just a short time. And then the British come in. I think it's June 29th. And he immediately starries her out and says, go back to Connecticut. And he doesn't do it in a loving way. And she's upset for weeks, but they make up through correspondence. And she goes back to Connecticut. But then he still won't let her come back afterwards. And so, of course, smallpox is ripping through the army as it had in Boston. But it's ripping through the army in New York. And so he says, well, you can't, in the army camp, and he says, well, you can't come back until you get inoculated. So reluctantly, she does go back to Boston, and she does get inoculated. But after that, she is raring to go. And a lot of times she does, but a lot of times he pushes her back. And she stays in many army camps. But when things get rough, he gets her to go off to other places. He won't have her there even at a distance from the battle. He just won't do it. And this is a source of contention with her. And I love this comment. She says, I may not be quoting it exactly, but she says, well, you may be the commander in the army, but when you're with me, we're equal. And really, she's more than equal. She kind of runs the show.
You get that impression that she really does, and that he's very good-natured about being under her direction. She also is a very good dancer and card player. Yes.
There are many, having come from an elite family in Boston, she sort of takes it on herself that she knows the protocol for all these festivals and celebrations. And there's a famous scene, I think it's the year after the Franco-American Treaty, where there's a celebration in one of the army camps, and Washington is there. And, she sort of arranges everything. And while Katie Green dances for, say 3 hours with Washington, she's there kind of overseeing everything. And she's a very good dancer. At that time, she's quite pregnant, but anyway, it's beside the point. Later, she becomes a card player. And after the Revolution, when Henry is Secretary of War and so on, and they're living in Philadelphia for a while, and there are all these festivals and meetings and celebrations and so on with other high-placed women. She's just insisting that they have to play cards, and this goes on throughout her life. There are people who left reports that later, when they moved to when they moved to Maine, Thomaston, Maine, she's still demanding that they must, even friends, social, they must play cards with her every day for so many hours.
Wow. They built quite an elaborate house up in Thomaston.
Yes. It's been restored. I've been there, Montpelier, and it's quite aristocratic. It's modeled on somewhat European and also Philadelphia Georgian architecture. It's been restored. It had fallen, of course, into ruin for many years, and then the citizens of Thomaston rallied, I guess, and other people, and restored it, and it's quite lovely, quite large. But here are two people who believed in the ideals of the revolution and equality and justice for all and the common man. And little by little, as Knox, who acquires most of that patent of the land in Maine, little by little, they become more and more aristocratic. I mean, at one time in that house, they had, I would read these things, they had like hundreds of people who would come for these celebrations. They had just summer guests and whatnot. It's quite amazing.
Well,
yeah.
I think we're just about out of time. This has been fascinating. Is there anything else we should talk about before we let you go, Nancy?
No, I think that, thinking about women then and thinking about women now, women then clearly knew their place, but they exerted a lot of control. And of course, the fight for equality only was whispered at that point. But, I think that just thinking about women today and where we are because of the pandemic in particular, there are always these obstacles for women. And I think it's a problem that's just very slow to resolve. But I loved the fact that those women, all of them, used their femininity as well as their brains to make better lives for themselves and their husbands.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nancy Rubin Stuart, author of Defiant Brides and The Muse of the Revolution, also a journalist, executive director of the Cape Cod Writers Center, and it's really been a delight talking to you, as well as a delight reading your books. I recommend them to anyone who wants a good story, well-researched, well-written. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, who helped to arrange for Nancy to join us. And I'll thank our musicians who perform our theme music, which is The Road to Boston, Doug Quigley, Peter Emmerich, Dave Emmerich, and thank you all for listening to the Revolution 250 podcast. So thank you, Nancy Rubin Stuart.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm going to shut us off.